My name is Emily Stolfo. I work for MongoDB. I work on the Ruby driver to the database, and I'm an adjunct faculty at Columbia University in New York City, from New York. And I'm going to talk about something that I supposedly know a lot about, which is gem API design for authors. But if you're a user and you haven't written a gem, or if you're thinking about writing a gem and haven't gotten to do that yet, this will be relevant for you as well. So this talk came about because I realized that I went through a transition from being a gem user, a web developer using lots of gems, to a gem author. And it's not the same thing. And I bet a lot of you will find that you have become gem authors as well, because a lot of us are breaking up our monolithic Rails applications into different services and putting common logic in a gem that we're using in those different applications. Or you've written a gem that you've open sourced and that other people are using and that you're maintaining. So whether or not you fall into either of those two camps, like an open sourced a gem developer, maintainer, or someone who wrote a gem that's proprietary, that's internal to your organization, there are many things that you have to think about that are different from the things that you have to think about as a developer. And so my personal story is that 2 years ago I was working as a Rails developer, and we got to the point where our Rails application was enormous and doing too many things. It was doing analytics, managing inventory using this application, as well as serving up public pages. And we decided to break it off into two applications for better maintainability over time. And we put all of the common logic in a gem. The gem was not open source. It was just a way for us to put all of our business logic and data models in one place. And so as we did that, I still did my Rails stuff, but I also had to maintain this gem, which is a completely different set of responsibilities or tasks as maintaining the application was. So I realized that before, my code had to work, and that was pretty much it. And it was serving customers who were using a browser and a mouse. But then I transitioned into becoming someone who was maintaining code that was consumed by other developers. Whether those developers were my future self, my colleagues, my current colleagues, my future colleagues, and if we eventually open source this gem, open source users. So this is not the same thing at all. Before, it was just fine for my code to work and to render pages and to do various back-end-y things, to being something that a code base that had to be approachable, maintainable, and clear to people who were using it or wanted to maintain it. So I found this online. I didn't want to put this gem on the spot, but this person says that they appreciated the contribution to open source, but they found that the gem itself was poorly documented. The architecture was horrible. There are so many horrible gems out there with horrible architectures, bad documentation, bad uses of the Ruby language and OO design. Don't use OO design. And if you're maintaining an open source gem, or if you're maintaining one that's not open source, it's not good enough that your code just works. You need to think about the architecture of your gem as well. And above all, you need to think about the fact that this gem is consumed by other developers, by users, humans on the other end of your code base. So gem API design is UX design, user interface, user experience design. You're building something that other users are going to use, that other developers are going to use. And this is not the same thing as web development. So there was this interesting experiment called the UX Fun experiment. Maybe you've heard of it. In 2006 and 2007, this boutique digital agency in Canada, I think, Toronto, identified 10 companies that they, according to their expertise, determined to have amazing UX experiences, such as JetBlue, Google, Apple, a bunch of other ones, like really well-known companies are having great UX experiences. They invested $50,000 throughout one entire year and watched the stock price go up for every single one of those companies. And they concluded that UX design and good user experience is directly reflected in stock price. We don't have a stock market, but we do have Ruby gems, and we do have the community. So your gem, the stock market for our gems is Ruby gems. We can watch the popularity of our gems go up or down. We can see competition. We can see comments on GitHub, people contributing. You can really get a feel for how popular your gem is and how well designed it is using the community. So even more at MongoDB, we call the team that I'm on, it's the drivers. I'm on the drivers team, which is part of a bigger team called the developer experience team, the DX team, which encompasses documentation, internal tools, the drivers. We officially support 12 drivers at MongoDB, and 12 languages, and we're about like 24 people, and depending on the popularity of the language, we'll have 1 to 4 or 5 people on a particular driver. And we all have an ongoing conversation all the time about common architecture, the experience of MongoDB. MongoDB got really popular in the beginning because it had an amazing developer experience, and it still does. It has a really good developer experience. I think the best example of this is the shell to MongoDB is in JavaScript, and everybody can write JavaScript. So it's a really friendly, we talk about users all the time. It's really one of our I'd say like our main priority is to think about the developer experience. So this team is really essential at MongoDB for maintaining the popularity and the accessibility of the database. So how specifically a gem API design, UX design? Well, first of all, you have users, and as I said, those users are developers. And I think the biggest thing that we sometimes overlook is that you have to know your users, whether those users, as I said, are your future self, your current colleagues, your future colleagues, open source users. It's really important to get to know these users, talk to them, and know how they're going to use your gem. So I personally go to a lot of conferences, in part because I really enjoy talking to Rubyists, and I like spying on you guys. I like listening to your talks. I like having conversations with you about the projects you're working on. I want to know what you like, what you don't like, what you're complaining about, what gems you're using, what idiomatic Ruby is today. It changes all the time. This is really important to me as a gem maintainer as input to make sure that the gem that I'm maintaining is in line with how you are writing applications. I'm not a web developer currently. I'm not in that world directly, so it's really important for me to come to these conferences, read blogs, use Twitter, talk to users, give presentations. Is a great way to get feedback as well. You can get great criticism from talking about the gem that you're maintaining. This is all really, really important if you're maintaining a gem. And establish trust. I can't emphasize this enough. The main thing I have to say about this is use semantic versioning. So semantic versioning, x.y.z, z is patch level, y is minor version, x is major version. Never break this. You will break the trust you have with your users if you break semantic versioning. This is a contract you have with your users, and if you want them to continue using your gem, you have to stick to this. I can't say I've personally broken that, but I know people who have, and they've learned a lot from the experience. And the other thing that I've found super important over the last year, or year and a half that I've been maintaining this gem, is that you should identify super users, or people in the community who are really enthusiastic and willing to work with you on the design of your gem, on giving you constructive feedback. These people will be your key users, your super users that you should have a conversation with continually. In particular, so at MongoDB, the Ruby driver team is doing a full rewrite because the driver is a couple years old now, and none of the people working on it currently were there in the beginning. So we often look at the code and scratch our heads and say, God, this is embarrassing. We really need to rewrite this. Everything works, but it's not every corner of the code base is something that I would be very proud of. So we're rewriting a new driver, and a couple of weeks ago I was talking to one of our super users, and because I was trying to figure out what timeouts we should have in the driver. Like, should we just have read timeouts, or should we have a write timeout as well? Should we only stick to socket timeout? Should we have a server-side timeout or an operation timeout? So right now we have a connection pool timeout. We have like so many timeouts. So I was trying to decide like which ones were the most important, so I wrote to him and I said, like, so in your ideal world, how many timeouts would you have? What timeouts are the most important to you? And I got really good feedback from him. So if you're maintaining a gem, this is one of the best things to do is to have an open conversation with your users. So moving on from users, we have users. Make sure you stay in communication with them. And now into UX design. So let's say you're designing a gem. What are the things that you should keep in mind? You can't just start coding. You have to know your users and know some principles before you start coding. What are some of those principles? Well, in UX design, there are a couple of main things, but mostly, these are the most relevant to writing a gem, is consistency, simplicity, and mapping. So what is consistency? Consistency is when you have symbols in the interface for your user that make it very obvious what is going to happen if the user engages with that knob or that thing. So a good example is buttons. We all know that a red button means danger and that a green one means success, et cetera, et cetera. There are tons of examples of this. Simplicity is not giving users too many knobs, not exposing too much to the user, keeping the interface as simple as possible. And mapping. I like this example a lot. It's a stove. And the first one shows, the first part shows a bad mapping, which is where you have 4 different dials, and it's not obvious from the interface which dial will turn on which component of the system. And the bottom shows you exactly, because there's a good mapping, you can tell if I engage with this one knob, what will actually happen in the system. So mapping is defined as a user, if I were to do one thing, it is really obvious to me what effect that will have on the system. And the other thing is, it is really obvious to me what state the system is in. So there's 2 things. There's the user engagement, and then there's the feedback from the system. And this is good mapping. So in terms of gem APIs and gem design, I'm going to go over 3 consistency considerations, 4 simplicity suggestions, and 5 mapping mantras. So keep these in mind if you're developing a gem or you're going to develop a gem. 3 consistency considerations. Consider consistent naming. This might seem obvious, but if you have a class that has a particular name and you have a reference to an object, an instance of that class in another class, make sure you call it by that class name, or you have some obvious way of referring to it, or some implicit, like obvious connection between the name of that reference in another class to that class name. So consistency across variable names, across method names, modules, namespaces. Think about the naming of things in your gem as one of the more important components of your architecture. Consistent style. So for the new rewrite that we're doing, we're using Rubocop. We find that it's really useful for setting a lot of specific parameters that we want to have in terms of line length, spacing in between when we have a hash inside parentheses, other things like method length. It can be a huge pain in the ass, but it is really great for keeping a consistent style if you have multiple people contributing to this gem. And this is really good also for people. We have it part of our test suite, so if people in the future are going to be contributing to our gem, they need to run the test suite and it will fail if they're not compliant with our style. And why is this so important? It makes it so that as you have new people working on the gem, or as I go back to my code later on, I know exactly how I should be doing things. So if I'm using the ternary operator as a particular style, if we decide to do that, then we want everybody in the future that is doing a similar thing to use that same exact style. Or if we choose to use the return keyword, for example, in certain logic situations. This is really important the more people are actually contributing to the same code base. And then consistent behavior. This is a little bit more difficult to explain, but basically if you're designing architecture in a class in a particular way, keep that architecture consistent between classes and namespaces. So it's really obvious to someone coming in and looking at the code or using the code what's going on when they look at it. So 4 simplicity suggestions. That was 3 consistency considerations. Now on simplicity. give classes a single responsibility. So we're all Rubyists. We know that we should give classes a consistent a single responsibility. I can't emphasize this enough. So I'm very happy when I look at our new code base because everything seems so crystal clear. We haven't finished yet, so I'm hoping it still stays really clear, but we have client, cluster, collection, cursor, database, errors, and node. To me, it's like super obvious what each one of those things does. They don't venture outside of their responsibility to try to do things for other classes. They really stick to their primary responsibility. And you want to design like this. You want it to be really obvious to someone looking at file names and class names as to what that class is actually doing. Just recently, I was cleaning up some code related to read preferences in the driver. Read preferences where you specify that whatever read I'm doing, I want to do on a particular node, so that you can dedicate certain nodes to certain queries if you want, if there are aggregations that are going to take a long time. And I found that there was some logic related to determining whether or not a query could be done on a secondary, not on a primary, in this module called support, but we had a module called read preference, and I was like, why is this not in read preference? If I were coming into the code base and trying to find some logic for read preference, which I was actually at the time, I was like, why is this code separated between two modules? So it was actually a function of the read preference module not always existing. It was put in later on, and the code was not completely consolidated. So this is bad design, to have logic spread out between different places. So this is single responsibility of a module. If this read preference module is dedicated to all the logic around a read preference, make sure you put all the logic around read preferences into that module. 2, hide implementation details. So this is where your API is really important. You don't want to expose too much to the user. You want to expose to the user only what's necessary for that user. And this is actually really difficult. You have to think as the user and say, I might know the implementation details, but does the user really, is this relevant to the user? You need to continually ask yourself that. So obviously use things like the private keyword, the public keyword, the protected keyword, add a reader, add a writer. We weren't so good with this, and we had a situation at some point in the last year where a user was using a method that we intended to be private, and we changed the API a little bit of that method in a minor version, and then that user became really angry because we broke his app that was using it. It was, I think, even another gem that was using it. So this is really important, to be extremely clear in documentation and in actually how you code what is public and private and what is intended for the users to use. And that sort of goes along with being frugal with helpers. So you can have sort of a bare bones, very simple, flexible way of doing certain things in your gem. Or you could add methods that make it extremely easy for the user to do those things, but it's not always necessary to add those helpers. So for example, in the Ruby driver we have, or in MongoDB you have indexes that can be of many different types. You can have geo indexes, text indexes, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have a helper for creating these different types of indexes, although some people have suggested or asked for it. So if we were to create a helper, it would be something like text index. But I actually don't really see the value of doing that versus just having create index, and then you pass in the type of index that you're creating. So this is an example where my preference is to have something very flexible for users to use. And adding a helper is just going to make more work for me. So if we change like the keyword that MongoDB expects when you're creating a text index, for example, I'm going to have to go and change all these helpers and make sure everything works. Whereas if I just like pass the type through to the database can throw the error if the user is using the wrong type. So just keep it simple and don't overuse helpers. There are situations in which helpers are great though. Design your API first. So at MongoDB right now, we're in the middle of, as I said, the Ruby driver is building this new driver, and everybody else is actually in the middle of rewriting their drivers as well, because we have this initiative to build a new, what we call Fluent API. And The reason we're doing this is because we know the implementation details, we know how the server works, but there are so many little parameters and little things you have to know about the server as MongoDB adds more and more features and becomes more sophisticated and advanced over time, that it's not obvious to users. They can't always just read the documentation and know exactly how to use the methods that we're providing to them. So this is a case in which we're like, okay, we can't have the update method or this find and modify thing. Like, really, what is find and modify? It's not obvious to the user based on the name and all of the, you could, the options, I only showed 3 here, but yeah, 3. But you can, I think there are like 6 that you can provide. And it's not obvious. You have to go through all the documentation and read what each one of these things does. But it's way simpler to do something like update one then get. So I don't know if it was obvious to you, but what find and modify is doing up there is updating one document based on a query and then returning it. You can decide to, you can do a find and modify that returns the old document by saying, I think, new false, and then you can do all this other crazy stuff. But we decided to just make things more easier for users to understand by creating methods and functions across all of the drivers that use this natural language update one then get. So this is where it's really fun to be on a team like this, especially at MongoDB, where we have people working on 12 different languages, and we're all working on a Fluent API together that will be consistent across all of the drivers. And none of us have started implementing yet. The Ruby driver has a little bit just because we're like that. But designing up front really puts the focus on the user. It's really important to do that. So that was 4 simplicity suggestions, and now 5 mapping mantras. So remember, mapping is user does something, it's really obvious what that thing, what effect that thing has on the system, and the system state is really obvious to the user. So first of all, monkey patching is mean. At the expense of maybe embarrassing a past colleague, I'm just going to breeze past this really quickly, but we found this method called lock with hack in our driver within the last year that was really awful. And basically, there was a monkey patch on lock on mutex, which sounds really scary, and it was. User refinements said, we can't actually use this in the Ruby driver because we have to support back to 1.8.7, but I actually don't have much experience with refinements, but if I was in a situation where I had to monkey patch, I really had no way around it, I would look to refinements before I would consider monkey patching. Don't do it. Someone's looking at your code. They're not going to, you're going to surprise them if you're overwriting some core Ruby things. 2, side effects are surprising. So we as Rubyists always follow this mantra that element of least surprise. So make things simple. Don't surprise your users. So for example, there was this case in which things like passing ops to a method, for example, a MapReduce, people could have a configuration for all the MapReduces they want to do. Like, for example, they could say they want the MapReduce to be done on a particular node in this ops config. Don't mutate their ops. Don't surprise them by mutating things that they're passing around by reference. So if someone in this case were doing a MapReduce after MapReduce and wanted to have the same config or the same ops for each one of those MapReduces, by doing this, you're messing up their config and you're going to surprise them. So don't do that. It's better to dupe and then alter the local copy. 3, requiring method chaining is impolite. It's impolite because you make your user's code look bad or look ugly and messy. This is, I don't know if Sandy Metz coined this, but she calls this a train wreck, or the law of demeanor, however you want to say it, meaning that there are too many links. One thing knows about the implementation of too many things down the line. So if you have something like this, that requires, if a user wants to get at the primary node and they need to chain all these things together, it's impolite because you're making their code look bad and it's sort of convoluted. It's much better to provide things like this, client.primary, much simpler. 4, informative error messages are imperative. I think the best example of this, obviously I'm biased and I'm sort of stuck in MongoDB world, but Mongoid has the most amazing error messages. For example, if I do a query and I am looking for a particular ID, Duran Jordan, who's the maintainer of Mongoid, he works with us part-time. He has like these really enormous, amazing error messages where he says, you got this error message because summary, you got this error message because of blah, 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 and then resolution. And he says you could set a particular configuration to false so that you won't get this error, or just search with an ID that exists in your database. But these are like the best error messages ever. And if you're going to want fewer issues logged against your gem, make sure that your error messages are extremely explanatory and clear for your users. Documentation without hesitation. So Chad said earlier today that inline comments are a code smell or design smell. I disagree. I think that there is a time and place for inline comments, in particular when you're writing something like a driver for a database where there are a number of specifications of the database or the thing that you're writing against or writing for that are not obvious to users. So if I find myself writing some logic that I had to consult the MongoDB documentation for and write some convoluted thing or write something that's very specific to MongoDB, I will write a comment and say, this is where you can't send a read preference to the MongoS, which is a routing thing for sharded clusters. Write inline comments. That'll make it so people can contribute to your gem really easily and know what's going on when they look at the code. That will also help, as I said before, your future self, your colleagues, your future colleagues. I don't think necessarily the inline comments are a bad design indication. Documentation tools. We use Yard. There are other ones out there. I really like Yard, but I haven't actually worked with many others. This is really great because you can just deploy it and have it and host it somewhere, and then people can engage with your documentation there. READMEs should be short and sweet. They should be startup guides. They should tell someone how to install a gem, get started with it. They shouldn't be tutorials. Put your tutorials elsewhere and maintain them separately. Put your full-blown guides elsewhere as well. They should be maintained separately. READMEs are great for someone just being able to evaluate your gem and see if it actually responds or satisfies the needs that they have. So I wanted to end on this note of documentation because it's sometimes overlooked, and I've found over the last year and a half that it's so important. It's really important to reduce the volume of questions you have. It's really important so you get the maximum number of contributions from open source users. It's really great for forcing you to write good code, actually. When I write documentation, or I write inline comments, it forces me to take a step back and think about my code and say, how can I explain this to someone to whom it's not really that obvious, or to someone who hasn't written this code or doesn't know the server that well? Documentation is super important and really shows that you're thinking about your users. So think like a UX designer. Think about writing a gem, whether it's open source or inside at your company, as a product. Think of it as a product development task. And the last thing I want to say is talk to me about the Ruby driver if you use it. So as I said, we're rewriting the driver, and I find it so valuable to talk to users to find out what they want in the driver, how they can use it in their apps, what kind of method helpers would be useful to them. My email is emily@mongodb.com, so if you don't get a chance to talk to me, please email me later on and tell me what you want out of the driver, because I don't have magic powers. I don't really know unless you tell me, unless I don't want to have to spend the time to stalk all of the social media outlets. But please feel free to tweet at me or email me, because it's all about users. Thank you.